My name is Barbara Bueller-Lines, and I'm the Sonny Kaufman Senior Curator at the NSU Art Museum in Fort Lauderdale. And I'm pleased to welcome Amy de la Haye to this afternoon's talk. It's my pleasure to recognize the sponsors of this remarkable exhibition, Lee Miller, the indestructible Lee Miller. Without your generosity, we would not have been able to do the exhibition. Please join me in a round of applause for these individuals and organizations. Let me say them first. We have David and Francie Horvitz Family Foundation, Paula and Jean Stevens, the David and Susan Samrick Foundation, and the Albertina Museum in Vienna, Austria. There we are. I would also like to recognize the sponsors for this afternoon's talk: Fashion Project at Bal Harbour Shops and the University of Arts, London. In addition to our sponsors, I would like to recognize the Museum Board Chairman, David Horvitz, and all board members in the audience. Thank you so much for coming. It is through your dedication and leadership that we are becoming, or as Bonnie says, we are, the premier cultural destination in South Florida. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Amy de la Haye is a curator and dress historian whose work is united by her emphasis upon telling stories with objects. She has curated exhibitions at the Victoria and Albert Museum, Brighton Museum, Selfridges, London College of Fashion, and the Palazzo Morando in Milan. She wrote with Judith Clark, Exhibiting Fashion, Before and After 1971, which was published by Yale in 2014. She was also curator for The Violent Hour, a film which explored a Parrish tea gown as part of the 1914 Now project, and has published about the fashion archives of Worth and Lucille, and conceived and written the Clara Button children's stories, Victoria and Albert Publishing. She is with Judith Clark, joint director of the Research Center for Fashion Curation, and teaches on the MA Fashion Curation course at LCF. Please join me in welcoming Amy de la Haye.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me. Thank you for inviting me here to speak. As Barbara said, I'm a dress historian and a curator, and what unites my work is that I tell stories with objects, and the objects that I use are garments. And nearly all of my lectures I call objects of a passion, after a quote by the French cultural critic Jean Baudrillard, who wrote that it ought to be obvious that it's the objects of our everyday lives that are the objects of a passion. And I would always argue that dress, more than any other media, evidences lives lived, especially dress that's been worn, because unlike other media, our dress becomes imprinted by our bodies. It physically alters in accordance with the shape of our bodies. And if you break dress, it doesn't smash or become instantly ruined. It perishes gradually with the passage of time. And we could sort of liken that process and the aesthetic sort of to human vulnerability. So, and also everyone can relate to clothes. So I'm going to tell you two stories selected from various projects I've worked on. And I've selected them, one because it touches upon war, the Second World War, and the second because it was explicitly about war. And so I'm going to share with you my research journey. So the photographs, mainly photographs I've taken in the course of my research. So some of them are from old 35mm slides. The quality isn't amazing, but it's going to take you on the behind-the-scenes stories, and I'll talk to you about how and why I've curated the exhibitions the way that I have. This is a castle in County Offaly in Southern Ireland, and it's called Birr Castle. And it was in the turret of this castle that I had my most magical ever curatorial moment. I was working on an exhibition of clothes at Brighton Museum, which is a museum on the south coast of England. And they housed a collection of clothes that had been worn by 6 generations of one family. And it was a family that rose from sort of middle-class respectability up to sort of royalty, with Lord Snowdon, the photographer who married Princess Margaret. It's a creative family, and a family that a lot of them were incredibly beautiful and were photographed by top photographers and illustrated by sort of Cecil Beaton. And outside of royalty, to have a collection of dress that has been worn by 6 generations of one family is completely exceptional. And what was even more exceptional was that quite often the clothes were worn by women through the generations, long before vintage fashion was worn. So quite often you might get a dress that, a mother had worn, and then as a young girl, her teenage daughter wears it. And the clothes some clothes were housed in various private homes, and some clothes were given to the museum. And it was the first time that we put all these clothes together and looked at them as a collection and tried to explore, what you can tell from the sum as opposed to the individual components. So we'd looked at the clothes in the museum, and then for Anne, she became Countess of Ross on her second wedding, and she moved to this castle in County Offaly in Southern Ireland called Birr Castle. I have to get used to the microphone. There's a curator at Brighton Museum called Eleanor Thompson. There's Professor Lou Taylor and myself working on this exhibition. The gardens of this castle are open to the public, but the house is a residence where they still live. And very kindly they said, you can come and you can look at the clothes that Anne stored. So we climb up the tower. When we get to the top of the tower, there's all these boxes on shelves. The amazing thing for us is that sometimes people are very territorial and proprietorial, and they're sort of looking over you. But Lord Ross just left us to look in these boxes. And before we even got into the boxes, the story was quite magical. So over the years, the women have, just stored different garments in different boxes, and they've just written, black or organza, organdy, which is cotton, fine cotton, dress by Irene Gilbert, and then a Le Coq Noir by Charlie James, which is a sculptural black dress by Charles James, who was recently exhibited at the Met. But sorry, okay, I'm not used to holding a microphone. So this is the moment. We open this box. It's a green crepe dress. It's got a purple glass neckline. But on the top of the dress is a note. And it's a note that Anne Countess of Ross has written, not as an aide-memoire for herself. It's a message for future eyes. And she's written, had an amazing time wearing this, I'm ashamed to say. 1941, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. So what she's saying is that, even in the midst of war, there were wonderful times to be had, occasionally. And obviously this dress it evoked a happy memory. And I would always argue that dress is an incredibly eloquent means of communication anyway. But that Anne, she'd added another layer of meaning. She'd written it for future eyes, for other eyes. It wasn't as a memory to herself. And so it immediately arouses our curiosity, what sort of wonderful time did she have wearing it? Where did she wear it? And Anne had 2 strategies. She felt so close to her family's clothes, and it was Anne that preserved them through the years. She clipped her grandmother's, her great-grandmother's, her mother's, and in turn she archived her daughter's clothes. And she had 2 strategies. When she gave them to the museum, she bombarded the museum directors with letters. And in her own homes, she added these notes for sort of future generations or whoever. Now, we know from experience, we know from sort of archival work that Anne's war was far from frivolous. Like many families, there were deaths in the family. Families' homes were turned over to become hospitals. And I'm just going to find a quote. The writer, the diarist, James Lees Milne, wrote, he describes Anne, he describes her, and I quote him writing about Anne, he saw her, quote, during the war in a hospital ward, her head tied in a charwoman's turban, vigorously scrubbing the floor on hands and knees, while enchanting the other ladies engaged in the same occupation with her jokes. So in spite of the horrors of war, there was a happy moment, and for Anne, this dress was a souvenir of that moment. And when her mother died, she regarded, in the absence of her mother, the clothes became the souvenir of her mother's life. So she was incredibly passionate about those clothes. And when they went to the museum, she sent all sorts of letters to the museum director saying, I don't want you to ever conserve these clothes. And she'd write incredibly poignant phrases, which in recent years we've become sort of accustomed to museology and people looking at garments or objects in very specific ways. But long before that was articulated, Anne wrote letters to the museum director and sort of said, don't alter them. I don't want synthetic thread. I don't want them restored. And then she wrote saying things like, their frailty is their meaning, or is their magic, don't you think? So she felt that even when the clothes were worn and were really old, they were still incredibly significant. She also felt they were incredibly significant in the context of her family. So throughout the generations, the family could have gone to Paris, which was the undisputed centre of international fashion, and bought haute couture from the top houses, and could have gone to Chanel and Patou, but nearly always they chose to support London fashion talent. So from when London couture emerged as an industry in the early 1920s, Anne becomes friends with and works with couturiers like Norman Hartnell, Charles James, not because she has to work, but because she's an incredibly talented seamstress and she enjoys it. So they champion British fashion talent throughout the generations. So as a collection, we've got this amazing group of clothes from top London designers, worn by various family members throughout the generations. And this is the full-length dress. And it's by a London house called Jacquemart, which was a fabric company and couture house in London. And the dress is remarkable, but it's the note that really arouses our curiosity and makes us want to know more about the dress. This is Anne's a passport. It's her wartime passport. She was incredibly talented in a creative way in her own sense. She was the sister of Oliver Messel, probably Britain's foremost theatre designer, and comes from a family of collectors, of plants people who travelled all around the world looking for special plants and bulbs, and had an incredibly privileged upbringing. She sort of said the V&A was her school because they were just left to run around the V&A. And so this is Anne in the 1930s, wearing, we don't know who designed this dress, but just extraordinarily beautiful, wearing really quite daring and adventurous, fashionable dress. And these are the various generations. And when we started to look at the collection as a whole, you start seeing certain stories emerge. And it became apparent that, like lots of English families, it was they were called the Sanborns, then the Messels, then the Rosses. They don't actively engage with modernity because Britain sort of had an illustrious past, and by the sort of early 20th century, that's less so. And a lot of sort of landed families continued to sort of live through their past, and so they would choose to live in historical buildings where there were, they had historical interiors. And throughout the generations, when there were historical revival styles of fashion, it was those styles that the women chose. So in the 1930s, fashion was inspired by Hollywood, by surrealism, but Anne consistently chose the historical revival styles. So she looked at she had neo-Victorian style gowns and neoclassical style gowns. The family enjoyed fancy dress throughout the generations, and they always dressed in 18th century fancy dress. They were keen plants people and travelled extensively. And often women's fashion, especially in summer, has a preponderance of flowers, but this collection seems to have more flowers than you might expect in terms of motif, but also in terms of corsage, in terms of fabric flowers. They travelled extensively, often to China, and consistently, when you look at the collections of the clothes, they choose chinoiserie styles. So in the 1920s, there were all sorts of modernistic influences, but Anne consistently chooses garments with chinoiserie motifs. They also wear non-Western clothing in fashion context, so they bring clothes back from China and wear them. And then the final generation, Lord Ross's son, has recently married a Chinese woman, and they had a sort of British wedding and then a Chinese wedding, and that's the image on the end. Sorry, this isn't very clear. What was also extraordinary was that this collection came with masses of contextual information in a way that the story I'm going to tell you subsequently, there wasn't. So they're a rich family, they've got multiple homes, they keep things, but they also were aware of how they were going to be regarded in posterity. And they keep all their letters, they keep diaries, there's receipts, one actually from the Paris house, Jean Lanvin. And so we found all sorts of insights into the women's lives and their shopping activities. And Anne adored fashion, loved making it, her mother loved it, but the previous generation, Marion, writes in letters, it's the sort of thing that we never hear about. We hear about people loving fashion, but Marion wrote letters saying, you know, she needed an outfit for a new occasion. You know, there was an incredible pressure to dress in a certain way, and she didn't enjoy it. And she'd go and she'd say, I've been to the department store, I've been to the dressmaker, I don't think what I've bought's right. And you also sort of saw the anxiety of fashion, how, you know, in certain social circumstances, it's an obligation, not always just a pleasure. This is the picture. This is one of the cases of Anne's clothes in the museum in Brighton, which we displayed by each generation. And what really struck me as extraordinary in this collection was that the women customised their clothes long, long before it was fashionable to do so. And even today, if you went to Alexander McQueen and spent multiple thousands of pounds on a dress, it would be really quite radical to come back and cut it or alter it or sort of sew a personal embroidery onto it. And that's exactly what these women did in the 1890s. So we've got two of Anne's mother's garments here, made by English court dressmakers. On the one, she's put a sort of Art Nouveau ornament, and on the other, she's embroidered it looks like a sort of Turkish metallic embroidery. And Anne had flowery dresses, and then she sometimes embroidered diamante onto them. So they consistently alter the elite fashion they buy. And this is a dress that Anne made for her daughter Susan. They're really talented dressmakers and embroiderers. And so she made this for her daughter Susan to wear to a garden party at Buckingham Palace, and again with this bright flower motif. And in the box that that dress was packed away with at Burghcastle, it says, Susan dress, I sat up and made in Bridget's flat in Mount Street for sudden invitation to Buck Pal. Something, I can't see, just party. I can't see the last three words from here. But so again, she's informing us for future eyes. And this is Susan, Anne's daughter, wearing Anne's Charlie James dress that she bought in the late 1930s, and this is Susan wearing it in the 1950s. So not only did we have the clothes that we could explore, there were amazing photographs, and this is the dress. In the Neo-Victorian revival style, evening wear, there were lots of sort of bustles and crinoline styles from about 1936 to 1939. This is Maud, Anne's mother's section in the exhibition, including fancy dress her and her husband Leonard wore from the 18th century. And this is Anne dressed as Pearl and photographed in Vogue by Cecil Beaton for a fancy dress party. And then amazingly, this dress, we found this at Burghcastle. It's from 1938. It was designed especially by Charles James for Anne, so not part of his collections. He designed a whole wardrobe for her second marriage. And this is a print based on Snow White. And we know that Anne went to New York in 1938, and that was the year that Snow White was the first full-length feature animated film that was released, and there were all sorts of commercial spin-offs like, you know, Snow White dolls, Snow White ceramics. And it would appear that Anne bought this fabric back to England. Charles James made the dress for her, and then amazingly, we've got the photograph of her wearing it. This was another Neo-Victorian style dress by Charles James from the late 30s that she wore. And because Anne felt so strongly that the clothes always had to be shown in the context of the family, there was a real dilemma about how you display them. I mean, it's always a big dilemma as a curator. It's our biggest expense is the mannequins, and it's one of our biggest dilemmas. What do we show these clothes on? And we clearly couldn't show clothes of Anne on a sort of Kate Moss type retail mannequin, or anything else that had definable features. So we had cheap mannequins, but very expensively cut to replicate the exact contours of the garment. This is a Chinese robe that Anne wore. And these are chinoiserie fashions. This is from a company called Neville in the early 1920s. It's Anne's coat. This is Anne's first wedding in the early 1920s, and where she could have had a sort of garçon modern short-style dress, she chooses a dress in the medieval style that her mother made for her. And this is the dress. I mean, made to exquisite dressmaker standard. But what struck me, and this is one of the dresses in the museum, so this is one of the first garments we looked at, was that when we unpacked this box, there was a trace of lipstick on it. And customarily as curators, if we exhibit objects, we tend to restore them to how they were originally intended to be. So if a plate was broken, or quite often we would try and restore it. And often it's the things that are marked or damaged that don't get exhibited. And I felt really strongly that it was a sort of trace of Anne. It was a trace of a life lived. It sort of does something to your insides, because you get a hint of the woman who wore the dress. And you desperately hope it's not the curator's lipstick. But assuming it's not, I made a strong case that I thought we should keep these traces of lives lived in the exhibition. And I'd had previous work where I'd argued the same case. And in 1994, I was curator of 20th century dress at the Victoria and Albert Museum and staged an exhibition at the museum which was completely radical then, called Street Style. And my design remit was that I focused upon design that led. And I argued that traditionally that had been haute couture and elite fashion, but in the 1990s, increasingly, it was street style too. And that we should also be collecting that and the high fashion spin-offs. And so, clearly you wouldn't take the mud off the psychobilly's boots or the grease off the biker's jacket. And it generated all sorts of questions. Well, if we don't, if we leave the dirt on the greaser's boots, why do we routinely remove the dirt from the 18th century dress? Because that also evidences the biography of the wearer. And it prompted a whole conference, big museum-wide national conference called Sacred Dirt ? Which sort of, got people to start thinking about, do we keep, you could say it's part of the integrity of the garment if it's part of its biography. In a social history museum, we wouldn't remove royal blood from a garment, but we would routinely do it in a design museum. So it generated all sorts of debate. So it sort of revived that previous interest. Now, this was Anne Mothers Maud's going away hat from 1898. And this is the interior of the dress that she wore with it. And the dress was completely shattered. But Anne didn't only collect dresses that were in good condition, she also kept dresses that were completely falling to bits. So it was really obvious that she didn't just keep them as exemplars of design, she kept them as souvenirs of her family's life. And when Lou Taylor had wanted to exhibit just the hat in the 1980s, she wrote to Anne and said, I'm sure you'll be delighted to know I'm doing a new dress gallery and we're going to feature your mother's hat. And Anne just got into a complete frenzy and said, you can't exhibit the hat on its own. And she felt so strongly that whether it was in the box or in the display case, that the hat and the dress had to stay together, because in the absence of her mother, these clothes were, to her, they were what evoked the memory of her mother, and under no circumstances could they be split up. And so she came and whisked them both away from the museum, and took several years to bring them back. So this was the interior. And this has completely inspired me to do a project which I'm now working on, which is called the Perish Dress Project, which is looking at, it's about exhibiting the unexhibitable, looking at the sort of things that curators see behind the scenes, but very rarely the public see. And actually, I think, have an incredibly poignant beauty of their own. And so in the exhibition, I also exhibited dresses that were falling to bits. And they're not all historical either. This is a 1930s dress by a London designer called Peter Russell. And you certainly, you rob the visitor of any sense of, the design, the relationship to the body, but it tells a different sort of story. If you bear with me 1 second. So I just wanted to quote, there's a wonderful museologist called Gaye Kavanagh, and she wrote a book called Dream Spaces. And I think as curators, over the course of our careers, we get certain books that are our Bibles, and Dream Spaces is one of my Bibles. And Gaye Kavanagh wrote, and I quote, "However defined or categorized, the transference of emotions and memory onto the concreteness of the object separates that object from the run-of-the-mill and appears to invest it with something almost magical. And I think that's exactly what happened with the Missel family dress collection. We could tell all sorts of stories. Because we had all sorts of biography, we could trace the lives of the women who'd worn them, where they'd worn them. There was masses of context. Now, the next exhibition I'm going to talk to you about was called Cinderellas of the Soil, and it was inspired by a pair of Land Army girl breeches that I bought in a second-hand shop. And in both World Wars, in America and New Zealand and Australia, as well as in Britain, land armies were formed. And they were formed because when the men and the horses went to war, especially in Britain, which was an island nation, we needed women to work on the land. And in both World Wars, the women wore breeches. And whereas most uniform that women in the services wore was a sort of feminized version of masculine uniform, the land girls wore a completely different sort of uniform. And until the land girls were often called the Cinderella forces because after the war they didn't get any of the recognition that other forces had enjoyed. They didn't get medals. They weren't allowed to march to the cenotaph in England. And also they carried on until the 1950s because in Britain, well, we needed them working on the land. And the land girls became noted by these breeches, which were known as elephant ear breeches. And there'd been exhibitions of paintings about the land girls, and there'd been all sorts of oral testimony books about the land girls' lives lived, but there'd never been an exhibition which told their story through the clothes they wore, and that's what I embarked upon doing. So the land girls on the left, in their 80s, they still describe themselves as land girls. They say it shaped their whole lives, and after years of, they've gone away, they've had families, they've come back, meet together all over the country regularly as land girls, and as they don't have a proper uniform, they've made their own. And they bear witness to a new era of austerity, a time of grave concern about man's impact upon man, the food we eat, and the global environment. And as historians and curators, if we do a project about a particular period, so in this sense war, quite often, if we do oral testimony, we focus upon the lives of those people as lived in war. But actually, they're people living today, and their lives today are incredibly, they're still incredibly pertinent. And with the land girls, the fact that they still describe themselves as the land girls, I felt that I'm going to look at their lives in the past, but also their lives today. So these are the land girls who helped me with my exhibition. And on the right is a photograph of the land girls in correct head-to-toe uniform in the Second World War. And this is a uniform in the First World War, so in both World Wars, their uniform they wear is really very similar. And in America, the uniform is almost identical too. And it would seem that the uniform evolved from gardening dress. And this is a gardening school. Lots of wealthy ladies had gardening schools. This was Lady Wolseley, and she had a gardening school in Sussex, where she taught women to work on the land. And the uniforms they're wearing are not dissimilar from the land girls' uniforms. And so when I was starting to research the uniform and the histories of the women, there are various sources that you go to. You go to autobiographies written at the time. Some are incredibly romantic, like Fragrant Earth. Others were much more racy, like If Their Mothers Only Knew, an unofficial account of life in the Women's Land Army, written in the 1940s. There are contemporary magazines. And there was the Land Army Handbook, which in all official documentation, I read said that every single land girl was given one, and I didn't meet a single land girl who'd ever even seen one, let alone been given one. But this shows them the uniform. And then in the 1980s, there was a big interest in sort of history from below, telling stories about lives that hadn't been covered by history, which tended to focus upon men and upon famous people, important events. And so there's masses of these autobiographies of Canadian, Australian, American, as well as British, which were published by small, often left-wing publishing companies, which tell the women's lives as they lived them through the war, which were an amazing insight. And then this was the beginning of my exhibition. And as you walked in, as I'd said earlier, I felt I really wanted to look at the women today. So we asked a number of women if they had a photograph of themselves in the Second World War, And then we took a photograph of them today in a similar pose, and it morphed from one to the other to show that, they're still women with lives today, and they each had a small souvenir. This was the correct uniform. And this is Doris on the right. Now, Doris became my absolute friend. And I started doing I did lots of book research, and then I started to go to wartime reenactment events and events that commemorated the Second World War, where the Land Army girls go. And we have sorts of people going to these events. We have all the historical reenactors dressed head to toe in authentic Land Army uniform, and we have the Land girls who had to give their uniform back during the war. And this is the first time Doris has handled a pair of Land Army breeches for, over 50 years. But she's wearing her sweatshirt with the Land Army badge. And in the same way that with the Messel family, I thought I'll be able to go and talk to Land girls, I'll be able to find stories about the uniform they wore, and they'll maybe have saved it. But that absolutely wasn't the case. It was a very different story I had to tell, because the uniform, if it had any life left in it when they left the Land Army, they had to give it back, and it would be given to another Land girl, or it was completely worn out. And so I told other narratives, and the narratives I explored were, rather than perhaps the biography of the individual Land girl, they were the biography of the breeches, looking at the cotton that might have been picked by Land girls in America. It's shipped to Britain. Often the ports were bombed and we'd lose all our cotton. It would go up and down the country, being made into corduroy and then into breeches, down to the south of England, where it was distributed and then dispersed to Land girls all over the country. And this is one of the galleries of the exhibition showing the correct head-to-toe uniform with paintings and ephemera and lots of testimony so people could listen. But what became clear as I was doing the exhibition was that it was much cheaper to buy garments than it was to borrow them from museums. Normally we'd get loans from museums. And as I was doing the exhibition, the Imperial War Museum, which would have been our major lender, stopped lending because they were doing major exhibitions of their own. But it became much, much cheaper. So I discovered that I could buy things on eBay. And I became obsessed buying this uniform on eBay. But what really, really surprised me was how many people were competing with me. And also the prices these things were going for. So I started writing to, at the time you could see who else was bidding, and then you could look at what else they'd bought. And it was clear that by some people's names, they were called things like Tank Girl, and it was clear that it was really obsessive people buying them. So I started writing them, saying to them, well, who are you? And, why do you want these clothes? Most of them ignored me, but one didn't. And it's a woman called Wendy Tumahalo at the back. And she sent me this photograph, and she said that her and her friends go dressed in completely authentic head-to-toe Land Army uniform to all sorts of agricultural events around the country and to wartime events. And it has to be authentic. So, I was completely astounded that an Airtex little short-sleeve shirt would cost over £100, but they hardly survive, and all these women are competing for them. So there were two sources that were selling them. One was vintage clothing detailers and others were militaria dealers. So I also wrote to them and said, where did you get this? I don't mind if you bought it in a boot fair and cost 10p, but can you tell me about the biography of this garment? And a man from Sefton Clothing wrote, Dear Amy, I bought this along with others, all brand new, from a Belgian militaria dealer who obtained them from an Italian rag merchant. I also purchased from the same source Land Army woolen overcoats. I can think of no military reason why these garments should be in Italy, and I wonder if they found their way there as part of some post-war disaster relief, flood, earthquake, whatever. It's just a possibility, but I do know that the Dutch authorities received British war surplus following the 1953 floods. Regards, Stephen. And it seemed that's exactly what happened, that these clothes had gone into Europe as post-war relief. Some things have been completely worn out, like the Airtex shirts, because you can incorporate them into an everyday wardrobe, and other things that were less wearable, like the breeches, had survived. And so whenever I bought them on eBay, they had never been worn, and they were really deeply creased, and they'd just been warehoused for 50 years. And suddenly they'd become desirable, so they're becoming on the market. And as a dress historian, as well as I'm interested in not only the point at which these clothes are made, but also what's happened to them in the intervening years. And it was interesting to think that these had been just warehoused maybe for 50 years. You must have them in America, but they're sort of militaria dealers. this was one of the displays, and we displayed them just on hooks because in the oral testimony books, lots of the land girls said, they got chilblains on their knees. They'd wash the garments out in cold water overnight, and they said that their wardrobe comprised a nail on the wall. So we tried to evoke that. And then with all the exhibitions I curate, I always have two objectives. One is the subject matter, and the other is how I engage with it as a curator. And I started to think that, museums tend to emphasize singularity. They tend to privilege single, rare objects of awe and wonder. And even if objects aren't rare and precious, they still, if it's a mass-produced, say, 1950s ceramic, which is considered interesting in some way, they tend to show one piece. Couture garments are shown as single objects. But there was something like 500,000 pairs of these trousers made during the Second World War, and it seemed really strange to exhibit them as one-off pieces. So I started thinking, well, how can I interpret these, and how can I convey numbers to visitors? And so I devised this design, which I called my wall of breeches, which it showed that they were made in multiple sizes, which surprised me. So from much smaller than me to much, much taller. And I also wanted visitors to consider what doesn't survive, because in museums we only see what does survive. And I wanted people to think, well, I can buy loads of breeches because they're not terribly wearable. I can buy loads of very, very small breeches for no money because hardly anyone can wear them. Medium-sized breeches are really hard to buy because all the girls who are wearing them wear them. And the Airtex tops, because they're much more wearable, are hard to buy. So I just wanted museum visitors to start thinking about, what we show and why. So this is one of the Airtex shirts that, completely eluded me. I think I managed to get one, and it was really expensive. And then in exhibitions of uniform, museums always show the correct head-to-toe uniform, yet it became increasingly evident that in all services, not just the women's services, and not just services that weren't subject to routine inspection like the land girls, that people customised and personalised their uniform. And so men told me about how they'd sort of steamed their hats, they'd done various things to make them fit them and look better. But the Land Army organisers were furious because the land girls consistently subverted the uniform. And this magazine, which again they were all supposed to have got and none of them had ever seen, this is the front page article, and it says, there's no doubt that the Land Army has the most attractive uniform of all the services, and volunteers should be proud to wear their uniform. And it says, it's a pity that some of them attempt to improve upon it. Uniform must be uniform or it loses all its point. Come out as gay or shabby or as bohemian as you like in civilian clothes, but don't try to express your personality in your uniform. And it was actually an offence to cut your garments up. So if you had dungarees and the knees wore out, it was an offence to turn them into shorts. But the number of them that survived shows clearly that women did. And I found all sorts of adapted garments. There's a pair of breeches made into shorts, dungarees, a man's wartime jumper that's been shrunk with Land Army badges on. And I also dissembled a pair of breeches, which for a curator is quite an unusual thing to do. But it was a small pair, and I wrote a statement saying that, small pairs tend to survive, because when people walk around dress museums, they often say, oh, people were so small. And they were smaller than us, but they weren't that much smaller. It's because it's small clothes that survive, because small clothes can't get altered. They can't be made bigger easily. So this was a small pair. And the point I wanted to make was how well-made garments were made in the Second World War, because it wasn't just the cost of materials, it was the labour, and the labour often had to be redirected to other forms of production. And so when uniform was made, it was made incredibly well. And it took two of my students, one a conservator, 2 days to unpick these trousers. And it showed all the component parts they were made from, including 7 different colours of thread. And then in the exhibition we had different narratives. So we had narratives for children, and you could follow this fictitious character called Iris Joyce around the museum, and they could play with farms and things. And what was completely magical about the exhibition was that it really encouraged all sorts of intergenerational initiatives. And we made a film whereby local schoolgirls interviewed the land girls. And at the end of the film, we asked the land girls what they expected, and we asked the schoolgirls what they expected. And they both said exactly the same thing, which was that they were surprised that they weren't that different, which was a lovely outcome. And so this is one of the land girls showing the schoolgirls the uniform. Oh, and this is the film that we made. And then at the opening, we did it especially early so all the land girls could come, because they're all in the sort of 80s now. And we had the Forces Sweethearts, which were these 2 women singing. And at the very end, we had Dame Vera Lynn come and sing We'll Meet Again, and this was the response of the Land Girls, whose all those years their work had been overlooked, and they'd not received the attention. So it was an incredibly moving experience seeing them like this. And I'd just like to conclude by showing you some of the work my students do at London College of Fashion. I run an MA in fashion curation with Judith Clark, and our students have to, in their second term, stage an exhibition without any money. So they have to raise money, find a venue, and stage an exhibition. And to start with, we said it might be hypothetical because we don't know if you can do it. And every single year they've managed it. And one year, one of them was a talented dressmaker, and they went to the college archives, got one white dress. She showed all the other students how to make one. So they all made one out of cotton sheeting, and it was called the White Dress Project, and they showed it in different ways. So this was the traditional dress on the mannequin. They showed a white dress upside down with a quote from Alice in Wonderland. They sewed a dress onto the doorstep, which, in England, we've got that reputation for rain, and it's your instant, immediate reaction not to tread on it. And it was meant to sort of evoke, like Christian Botanski, who does, makes those gallery installations of piles of clothes. And when you say to children, you can walk over them, they say they won't because it's like walking over dead people. And, and there were multi-sensorial experiences, so you could put your hands at the back through and feel it. And then another year, they had a terrible problem trying to find a venue, and in the end they found an old police station in the south of London, and they did a project all about transparency, and you had to look through all of the cell windows and you saw a different dress. So these were some of the scenes they set up. And then I just wanted to finish on, this is the character that I've written a book about, Clara Button and the Magical Hat Day, and it's all about memory, and it's about a little girl whose grandmother was a milliner, but she never met her, and she has a button tin, which was my grandmother's button tin. And just to conclude, this is the end of the book where Clara's laying in the night sky. And just finally to say that in a world where everything seemingly is at our fingertips, and we can access almost everything on the internet, we don't have the experience that people had 150 years ago, where they would maybe see a cabinet of curiosity and they would see objects of awe and wonder which they might never see in their other lives. And so as curators, if we want people to come to museums as opposed to going to shopping malls or going to the football pitch, what we have to do is construct magical narratives that engage all sorts of people and inspire them to come to museums, and so they get an experience where in some way they feel transformed or altered, so that they get an experience that they can't get elsewhere in their life. Thank you. I was going to take some questions, if anybody had questions.
If anybody has any questions, we'll be walking around with microphones.
You said, why was corduroy?
Thanks. Why was corduroy chosen as the material to manufacture those land breeches?
Okay. I was really interested why so much of the Land Girls uniform was made from cotton, because in the UK we don't produce cotton, and it seemed completely extraordinary that we had a land army to feed the nation because we couldn't bring food in on ships, yet we were bringing cotton in on ships. But Britain had lots of pre-war supplies of cotton in warehouses, and it does seem that some got through. But corduroy was chosen in particular. It was made in a particular area of the UK called Hebden Bridge. It was sturdy. It was fairly soft and it was sturdy. But when corduroy supplies ran out, they also made them of a heavy twill, cotton twill fabric. But as far as I know, corduroy wasn't used by the other services. And so it might also be because the army coats were made from cotton drill, and all the time the forces were privileged. And so the same khaki drill was required by the men sort of working in Egypt as it was for the land girls. But the problem with the land girls was that the government had a policy of sending them away from home, and there wasn't, the people who worked in the girls in the country, you didn't need to recruit because they were already working in the country. So they were recruiting girls from the towns and sending them all over the country. And quite often they were sort of 17, 18 years old, and they were going to live in a remote farm with an elderly couple whose sons had perhaps gone to war. And they didn't have any clothes to wear on the land. And there's all sorts of documentation in the archives where, the women who are organising it are saying they have nothing to wear. They needed Wellington boots, but the rubber was made in Malaysia, and then rubber supplies dried up. And corduroy was one fabric that does seem to have been generally available. But it was a major problem throughout the war. And also they made them in so many different sizes. And so there's all sorts of order forms. I mean, it was an administrative nightmare ordering in advance the sizes that you think these women might need. And then what happened as well was they came from the towns and they start doing hard physical labour on the farms, and their bodies change. And so often the uniform that they were given at the outset within 6 months didn't fit them because their bodies had become, stronger. So it was another narrative of war that just doesn't get told, but, just the manufacture and distribution and wear of these uniforms. And I always wanted to think quite poetically that, they were made from natural fibres, from cotton predominantly, and it was quite poetic to think that perhaps, the uniform had been made, including the corduroy, it had been grown in the fields. It goes to be made into fabric, made into trousers. They're worn out until they're unwearable, and then they're made into shoddy, and that's perhaps returned to the land as fertiliser. Were there any other? I beg your pardon?
The breeches were made without patches underneath.
No, they didn't have patches, absolutely. Which is crazy. You would think they would have had patches. Yeah, and also because the land girls are always saying that they got chilblains on their knees because the knees split and they were freezing cold, and they washed them and they couldn't dry them in time by the next morning. I did write a book about the land girls, or about Messel. The Messel. There is a book, and it's called Fashion and Fancy Dress. And it was published by Philip Wilson.
Thanks.
But if you Google my name and Messel, it will come up. You can buy it on Amazon. And it tells the story of the research, but it also tells the story of the women through the generations and their clothes.
How many women were a part of the program?
The Land Army.
Yes, ma'am.
I can't remember the exact number, but thousands. Thousands, tens of thousands of women. Tens of thousands of women. And in the First World War, we didn't form a land army in Britain until 1917, at which point Britain was literally about to starve because there wasn't enough food. And so from the day war was declared in the Second World War, preparations had already been made for a land army, so there was a land army in place from the outset of war, and they sort of established, where they would go, uniform production, and so it was really well organised in the Second World War. Yeah, tens of thousands of women. And lots of them today, they completely attribute their good health to working on the land and working physically. And when I spoke to them, lots of them said they chose it because they actually wanted to leave home and get away from home. But also, it was about, whereas so much of war was about destruction and death, actually working on the land was about, creation and growth and nurturing animals, and, and they're working in the open air, which is hard, but they're not being completely poisoned working in munitions factories. So it was a very conscious choice for an awful lot of women. Sorry. The Messel family, they would have stored them because it was one of those sort of English families that values their history, and because they've got big houses, I think they just store things. But they kept everything, so their letters. So there are certain families that, they have an eye on the future. And also, working in museums, whatever media you work with, it's often, as we get older, it's often people in their 70s and 80s who start making preparations for death, and it's at that point they start giving things to the museum. And Anne was 79 when she gave the first batch of clothes to Brighton Museum. But I suppose what I would always like to have known is what was the decision-making process? She gave her wedding dress to Brighton and various garments, but I would love to know why she chose to keep certain garments in family homes and why, what was the selection process? She obviously made a very deliberate choice. So yes, absolutely, they would have kept them because she felt that dress was, it was a souvenir of the women's lives. The men were more famous. And she saw dress as a holder of family memory.
I have a question. I don't know if you're familiar with the program. It's on public broadcasting. It's a series called Selfridges.
Yes.
And it's a fascinating program because it shows how each decade, how the fashions changed and how important it was that he had the proper window designer when fashions changed to be able to dress the windows properly, the mannequins properly, and it's really very fascinating looking at the change of fashion each decade. And when the World War I started, he employed women in every phase or every department of the store to provide income for them whose husbands were off at war. And I just think it's a fascinating program.
Absolutely, yeah. Anyone else? Thank you.
Thank you.